You know, when you think about the 1973 film The Exorcist, you probably think it's one of the scariest movies ever made, right? But what if I told you the scariest part wasn't the demonic possession? It's a true story hiding in plain sight, about a man who appeared in the film and then went on to commit a horrific murder. That's right, one of the most iconic horror movies of all time actually features a man who wasn't just acting. It's this crazy story that completely blurs the line between the horror you see on screen and, well, a much darker, grittier reality that played out just a few years later.
So you gotta be asking, right? How does someone go from a Hollywood film set to the middle of a murder investigation? Well, it all kicks off with this totally random encounter in a New York City hospital.
So this is Paul Bateson. Back in the early 70s, he was just a regular guy, a 31-year-old radiology technician. He had a decent, respectable job at a New York hospital and, from the outside looking in, his life seemed totally normal.
Yeah, how he ended up on the big screen was pure luck, really. The director of The Exorcist was scouting the hospital, doing research for a medical scene, and he was just so blown away by the realism of Bateson and his crew that he basically cast them right there on the spot to play themselves.
And here's where it gets really wild. The scene he was in, a cerebral angiography, it ended up being praised for how unsettlingly authentic it was. So he actually helped create one of the most disturbing moments in the movie, long before he went on to create a real-life horror story of his own.
But, after that little brush with Hollywood fame, Bateson's personal life started to completely unravel. And it happened fast. So think about it. In 1973, he's part of this massive cultural moment. But just 4 years later, by 1977, his whole professional life had totally fallen apart. He got fired from the very same hospital where he'd been discovered, mostly because his personal problems were just getting way out of hand. So yeah, on the surface, he was the guy from The Exorcist, but underneath all that, he was battling some really serious demons. A 9-year relationship had just ended, leaving him incredibly lonely, and on top of that, he was wrestling with a really, really bad drinking problem. And when I say a bad drinking problem, I mean severe. To give you an idea, he was downing more than a quart of vodka every single day. We're talking about a guy who sometimes started taking shots before he even got dressed. This wasn't just a habit, It was a full-blown dependency that was just eating him alive. And this whole destructive spiral of drinking and loneliness, it was all building towards something terrible. It all came to a head on one violent, tragic night in 1977. Okay, so Bateson's out at a club. He meets this guy, Addison Verrill. Now, Verrill was a pretty well-known journalist, a film critic for Variety magazine. They start talking, hit it off. Seems they both had an interest in partying. So the night goes on, Lots of heavy drinking, some drugs are involved. They hop from one bar to the next, and eventually, super late, like 5 in the morning, they end up heading back to Verrill's apartment. But at some point in the night, something shifts. Bateson gets this idea in his head that Verrill isn't looking for a real connection, that he's just another one-night stand. And for Bateson, who was already feeling so desperate and lonely, that feeling of rejection, mixed with all the alcohol and drugs, something inside him just snapped.
He walks into the kitchen, grabs the first thing he sees, a heavy frying pan, and just hits Verrill over the head. Then he grabs a knife and stabs him, killing him. And after all that, he robs the place, takes cash, a credit card, a passport, even some clothes, and then he just leaves.
And for a while, it looked like he was going to get away with it, The police had absolutely no suspects, but the way he actually got caught, honestly, it's almost as bizarre as the crime itself. Right, so the police investigation basically hits a dead end. Since Bateson and Verrill had literally just met that night, there was nothing to connect them. The working theory for the cops was just that it was a robbery gone bad. Bateson's name wasn't even on their radar. So, how did they catch him? It's this incredible, unbelievable chain of events. First, a journalist, who is actually a friend of Verrill's, writes this article tearing into the police for not taking the murder seriously. Well, Bateson reads it, and full of guilt and completely drunk, he calls up that same journalist and confesses. He starts sharing details that only the killer could possibly know. Then, a little while later, someone else that Bateson had confessed to calls the police with his name, and boom, they knew exactly who to look for. So, Bateson gets arrested. He's put on trial for the murder of Addison Verrill. But his conviction, it didn't really close the book on this. In fact, it opened up an even more disturbing question. Okay, so the outcome of the trial itself was pretty straightforward. He was found guilty, sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. But believe it or not, that is not where this story ends.
See, while he was convicted for the murder of one man, Addison Verrill, a lot of people were talking to authorities, even the director of The Exorcist himself. They started to suspect he was connected to a whole series of other unsolved killings of gay men that were happening around New York at that same time.
And what's maybe the most chilling part of all this? Bateson himself seemed to add fuel to that fire. While he was in prison, there are reports that he would actually brag to other inmates about being responsible for other murders that the police could never, ever pin on him.
Which just leaves us with this one final terrifying thought. The guy whose hyper-realistic performance helped make a horror movie feel so real, he might have been a monster far more terrifying than anything Hollywood could ever dream up. So you have to wonder, was the murder he was convicted of just the one time he got caught?